as the lights go down, everyone scurries to their seats. Good afternoon. It's lovely to all see you here at the Nimoy Theater in Westwood. I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Programs and Strategic Engagement for the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. We are in the midst of our fall season of Aloud, the Library Foundation's public programming series. We still have many programs ahead. On October 19th at Grand Park, we will be presenting Latino poetry, Places We Call Home, with readings and music from renowned Latin writers and musicians. And on October 30th at the Downtown Central Library, we have an evening with the celebrated writer Andre Ossaman and the Los Angeles-based book critic and journalist David Yulin. To learn more about our season, visit lfla.org/aloud. For those not familiar with the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, we are a private, nonprofit organization devoted to fundraising, advocacy, and innovative programming in support of the Los Angeles Public Library. If you are not yet a member or supporter, I hope you will consider supporting the Library Foundation of Los Angeles to see more programs like this one and to increase critical access to information, resources, and technology to help Angelenos improve their lives and to fulfill their dreams. I want to acknowledge some of our council members here today. The Council of the Library Foundation was founded 30 years ago, and over that time, they have raised millions of dollars in support of the Los Angeles Public Library programs, which benefit Angelenos of all ages. Thank you for being such an exceptional, long-standing ambassadors for the library. And thank you, Beth Michelson, who's in the audience, the Council President, for your dedication, enthusiasm, and leadership. I'd also like, this is a very long list, so forgive me. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Aaron Fox Schiff, Deloitte, the Golden Globe Foundation, Steve and Judith Krantz Foundation, the Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Sharon Oxborough Endowed Fund for Aloud, Peck Endowment for Cultural Programs, the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, and of course, all the individual foundation donors and members in the audience. Now, for this afternoon's exciting program, I'm very pleased to present today's exceptional guests, Yuval Sharon and Alex Ross. The two will discuss Sharon's debut book, A New Philosophy of Opera, which explores opera's capacity to transform itself and to afford interdisciplinary collaboration. The book is a compelling plan of action, throwing all convention aside, of course, for the future of opera, taking it from being considered an elitist art form to a cultural phenomenon with accessibility to all. Using examples from his career, this vision of the anti-elite opera celebrates innovation and the imagination. As Yuval writes, quote, "The status quo in opera is elitism, and the arts form elitist tendencies, viewing audiences in large swaths differentiated by class, all too easily eclipse its aspirational potential, the art form's ability to speak to a single spectator and to support their process of individuation. To nourish opera's aspirational quality, its ability to serve as a mechanism for imagining a different world, we need to cultivate an anti-elite approach in the spaces where opera is performed and in that way." Just a reminder aside to everyone, we have the Reparations Club, a bookstore that's terrific. They will be selling Yuval's book in the lobby, and he will be signing afterwards. And now Yuval Sharon is an opera director and a MacArthur Fellow. He founded the Industry in Los Angeles, where he directed new operas in moving cars and train stations. An artistic director of the Detroit Opera, he transformed the company into a premier destination of progressive opera. He'll be in conversation with Alex Ross, who has been the music critic at The New Yorker since 1996. He writes about classical music, covering the field of the Metropolitan Opera to the contemporary avant-garde. He's the author of 3 much-lauded books. Ross is also a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Arts and Letters Award from the Academy of Arts and Letters. Please welcome Yuval Sharon and Alex Ross.
Hello, welcome everyone. Very happy to be here with Yuval Sharon and his new book, New Philosophy of Opera. And we're just going to plunge right in without too much preamble because there are so many different aspects of this book. I think each chapter we could sort of spend a whole hour talking about aspects of individual chapters and general concepts having to do with opera as well as Yuval's many remarkable projects. So we're just going to plunge right in and then sort of see where the conversation goes, and then toward the end, open it up for questions. But let me just start by asking about your entree into the world of opera, and because very much the whole book stems from your, you talk about your early experiences with opera, satisfactions as well as dissatisfactions, how it led you to want to undertake opera directing yourself. But yeah, tell me about sort of just your early encounters with opera and sort of how your view of the art form evolved from there.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to do so, and also I'm so happy to see familiar faces here. So always so happy to be back home in LA. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to Aloud for inviting me and Alex to be in conversation here. I do indeed in this book spend a lot of time talking about my first experiences with opera because I think it's important for people that are not already opera lovers to kind of remember that going to the opera the first time is incredibly disorienting and often very forbidding, and maybe scary is a little too far. But for some people, it might also be really scary to go into this building where my first opera was La Traviata. This was before there were super titles. And so I was sitting there and not understanding anything that was happening in front of me, and everyone around me having this reverential kind of thing that I felt as a 13-year-old kid that I was completely out of place. And then suddenly there would be a big climax where I thought, well, of course we're going to applaud. Well, we didn't applaud for some reason, And then there was something that did not seem like a place to applaud, and everyone's shouting bravo. You're suddenly in. This was in Germany too, so I mean, like I'm in a theater in Germany where everyone's screaming. That was scary. All right, so that was that had a. So there is some terror going to the opera too. Anyway, but I really always think back, now that opera is my whole life, I do always think back on what it was like to be a kid and coming into that environment of opera, and why the only reason I ended up doing opera is because my dad kept taking me. If he had never taken me again, I'm sure I probably would be like, yeah, I saw an opera once. It was weird and off-putting, and I never want to go again, But instead, my dad did take me over and over again. It's one of opera's big challenges because, it is let's say, in many ways, it is better if it's an acquired taste, like so many other things that end up being incredibly rewarding for us to participate in. And yet, something needs to grab you the first time you go. And so it has, in many ways, propelled me into thinking about the kind of opera. Once I realized opera is what I want to do with my life, I still always think back on those first encounters and how can we make those encounters not exclusionary, not scary, not off-putting, but alluring enticing, exciting, something that can feel like it is more connected to the life that we live outside of the theater. That's really where I started thinking about the kind of opera that I wanted to make.
And so when did you make your first attempts at directing opera?
Well, I have to say that my first opera that I ever staged was a Wagner opera. It was I like starting right at the top. If I'm going to go into it, let's go right for it. But it was his opera Meistersinger, which I staged in a kind of regional company in Berkeley. I went to school at UC Berkeley. And the regional opera company invited me to do Meistersinger in a cut version and for a small orchestra. But I was thinking, well, Meistersinger makes a lot of sense if we connect it to kind of like hippie Berkeley in the 60s life, because it is this kind of utopian fantasy of community and things like that. So right from the beginning, I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to do opera, let's see if I can do opera in a way that is going to question its validity to our community and to our time. Now, I seem to recall that was not very well received, but nevertheless, it got me. The bug at that point had really bit me, and I realized that process of thinking about how opera can be, let's say, an emerging art form, rather than an art form about preservation or reproduction of already existing ideas, because if you're thinking about opera in those kind of terms, you bring a lot with those. When you redo opera the way it has been done, you also bring along with it a lot of old social values that we no longer espouse or that we no longer can really believe in. But as soon as we change the way that opera is presented, including maybe cutting them up, not just putting it in the 60s, but like thinking about new ways in which the art form can not just carry with it its kind of ideological underpinnings of where it came from, but could actually speak to maybe some progressive ideas that we would like to see in our world. That's what I really started to look for a way to do.
Right. So, you talk a lot in the book about the operatic canon and the challenge of being an imaginative and progressive director, simply as someone who wants to sort of undertake creative and innovative activity in this field, in a world where the canon is so dominant. And you sort of talk about sort of how it came to be that way. How for centuries, of course, there was no canon. Opera was new opera. Really, most of the way through the 19th century, and if you think about Italian opera in the 19th century, there were some revivals, but it was all about the latest work and the sort of rising young composers, really into the first decades of the 20th century, and opera actually was. Sort of underwent that sort of development of a canon like a bit later than orchestral music. Because by the sort of middle of the 19th century, already the music of no longer living composers was beginning to crowd out living composers, and that was very much the case by the end of the 19th century. Whereas in opera, it remained dominated by new work, and then it changed, and I think. This is something I think about a lot, in my own work and in writing. Sort of how can we redress this balance? And I think your career is a model in that you're not ignoring the canonical works. You've directed Wagner, you've directed Mozart, La Bohème, but at the same time, you've really engaged with new work. Of course, the industry here in LA has been essentially entirely new work, and so how do you sort of confront that? Because it is so institutionalized at this point, where sort of audiences and board members and administrators think it's always been this way, but it's actually a very recent development. So what are some of your strategies for challenging that mindset?
Yeah, well, I should say the first strategy is just just pushing ahead. Like writing a book like this, for example, is a way of trying to give audiences a language for understanding a different way that opera can be presented and experienced. And I think that that's what I was really drawn to in writing this book, is I wanted to give people, especially if people are not already deeply immersed in what they think opera is, maybe I can help draw a roadmap for a different way of thinking about it. And I have to, I mean, since this is a theater of so many friends, I'm just gonna share something that I probably won't share with too many people, which is that the title of the book, A New Philosophy of Opera, is a real bait and switch, okay? There is, in so many ways, what I think of as a philosophical understanding that I have of opera comes so much from people who have really built up an idea of what opera is. So when I use the word new, it of course opens up this possibility of like, well, what's new about what you're doing? It makes me think about the California artist Alexis Smith, who wrote this she created this beautiful piece where she says, there is nothing new except that, this is a paraphrase, but since I know there's some visual art people here, but there is nothing new except that which has been forgotten. And I think that is so powerful when you think about opera, too, because in many ways, what opera has been forgotten, which was opera as something totally spontaneously created, something that was a wild amalgamation of so many diverging perspectives, a whole range of artists coming together without a roadmap. They weren't doing what an institution says, here is how you make an opera. They were making it up as they go. You know, it's like the image of building the bridge as cars are already starting to drive over it. That's what an opera production really should feel like, you know? And the making of an opera really should have that element of riskiness and this venture into the unknown. And somewhere along the line, and as you mentioned, Alex, it's later than symphonic repertoire, but for my research, it was like early 19th century, especially as Rossini came into being and Donizetti, and there was really now an emphasis on one sole author, as opposed to this multi-authorial thing called opera, you know, which is so strange and so weird. But around the early 19th century, it started to become canonical. Mm-hmm. And in that process, it started to become formulaic. And I think that we now, and maybe many of you in this room might agree with me, when you think of opera, it's hard to divorce it from that formula that we now expect of what happens in grand opera with usually the soprano dying, being killed in some way. You know, like all of these formulaic, even with new operas, sometimes they just still can't get away from these things that we kind of expect opera to be. And I think that has really suffocated that initial impulse that made Monteverdi write opera at the very birth of what opera was. So new philosophy of opera in many ways is just a way to call back what has been forgotten and say, it's new, because we have lost in a way that sense of the impulsive, expansive kind of idea of what opera can be.
Yeah, and the sort of the multi-author framework, collaboration. You talk about Martin Buber and a philosophy of Ich und du, kind of dialogue and sort of collaboration as a model, as opposed to this sole author model, which I think it's a very good point to sort of address canonization in those two stages. You know, first, the focus on the single dominant voice of the composer, and then the second phase is the tilting, the emergence of the repertory, and so now you have a sort of almost literal kind of canon of saintly figures of the past, you know, who are supplying these eternal masterpieces, and you lose all touch with what's going on in new music. And so you talk about Monteverdi, the Florentine Camerata, and Monteverdi and opera in Venice, and this idea of returning to something which is much more multi-voiced, much more just inventing the genre as you go along. If you just think about how quickly it changed from this aristocratic endeavor to Venetian opera in the middle of the 17th century, which is much more populist in spirit. The diva emerges as a powerful figure, and so in a way, what you've done with the industry is sort of a return to the beginning of opera, as opposed to a rejection of the tradition. In a sense.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, and I know there's some board members from the industry here, so I'm so happy to see you all. And I think that we've talked about it as a board before. Why are we calling ourselves an opera company? Because we seem to be doing something that's just so different. Whether it's operas in moving vehicles or the train station, or this idea of a completely bespoke creation with all of these creators working together. Why is this still opera? And I remember it's come up a lot, and I always ended up saying, I actually think that's what opera is. Like, I think that the kind of stuff that we have been doing with the industry is what opera should always feel like and be like. That's not to say that opera should only be in cars from now on. I've also been doing things in the normal theater. It's not. I feel better in the car than in the actual theater. But nevertheless, it's that idea of just trying something that's totally new instead of feeling like I'm fitting a pre-existing formula that someone else has created and that nobody's really put a lot of pressure on to see, does this still make sense? Is this still a valid way to tell stories, to share time and space with your community? Is this the right way to really gather people together to meditate on some of these ideas? Or can the form in which we gather and experience music and narrative, shouldn't that form also be changed as we're experiencing new, as we are changing, as our own community is changing? And so for me, it's actually been a lot about form with the industry and trying to think about the format in which people experience it. How do we open that up and allow our crazy contemporary way of dealing with this world? How can the form of the opera relate to that or help us understand all of that better? So I've been really interested in that. And I think to your previous question, I do then try and bring some of that thinking into the canonical pieces like La Boheme, and thinking, well, Merrily We Roll Along has a huge success right now on Broadway after not working the first time it came around. Why is that? I think we are actually culturally more open to things like reverse chronology, to doing things, and thanks to episodic TV, I think we are pretty used to the idea that you can start at the end and go back to the beginning, and it's not confusing. It's actually kind of really interesting. So I think, well, let's try that with opera. Why don't we do La Boheme starting from the end, Act 4, and then Act 3, and then Act 2, and then Act 1, and just see what that feels like. And musically, I think it worked really well. If I could say for myself, I think it worked really well. And in many ways, it was one of my most conservative productions in terms of the visual. I really didn't want to change anything except the form, just to see what does it mean to play with form with these classic works. And it's still, like if you were a first-time La Boheme, if it was the first time you ever saw La Boheme, from what I heard from audience members, it was a joy and a pleasure to end with love and to end with the two characters just going off into the proverbial sunset, singing these high C's off stage. It's like, yeah, it worked really well. But if you were a kind of dyed-in-the-wool Puccini lover, this was such a heresy, and I got so many angry letters about how dare I redo the order of a piece that's over 100 years old, So those battle lines are still really drawn today, let's say.
Right.
But I really do think if we can start thinking about these classic works with that same sense of formal ingenuity, I think we'll realize they don't feel old at all. They actually will feel incredibly of the moment and of today. So I think back on, before opera was so canonical, the idea that you would take a pastiche of even different composers, and you'd say, we're going to create our new piece, we're going to take one aria from this, we're going to take one aria from that, oh, we gave that aria to you, but you're not sounding that good in it, so we're gonna cut it. You know, like it was being made. You know, and that is to me is so exciting, and I would love to see us have that kind of attitude towards the kind of classic repertoire. I think it'll add so much to our understanding of why we should still do it in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, there is a sort of tremendous contradiction in terms of how opera is produced these days, because, you know, on the one hand, you have this sort of absolute devotion to the letter of the score, and the sort of slightest changes can be seen as heretical. Sort of people get upset if a soprano kind of adds a sort of high note which is not marked in the score, unless it's the traditional high note, which no one says anything. But so generally, sort of the score is graven in stone, even though no one is actually playing these pieces as they were originally heard, because the orchestras are completely different, singing styles are different. We have really no idea how opera sounded in the 17th, 18th centuries, but we think we're sort of following the letter of the score. But then everything else is up for grabs. So in terms of the direction, you know, especially obviously on European stages, there's this very bizarre situation where the orchestra is sort of very precisely following the letter of the score, and everything else you see on stage has absolutely nothing to do with the libretto. And I feel like the tension there is there's this urge not to endlessly repeat the same thing. The form simply cannot survive if it's just exactly repeating everything as it's always been done. So there has to be some give and take. And so opera direction has been this kind of outlet for our need to do something different with these scores, which are just done over and over again. You know, but the first way to create a different kind of outlet for the energy, of course, is to do more new opera.
Yes,
but with the older operas, you know, there can be other ways to let the performers have more collaborative voice and more of a real collaborative role in what they're doing. And I think with your productions of the traditional repertoire, you've created more of that leeway.
Yeah, I've certainly
for the performers.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess, you know, in more conventional opera houses, if I'm working in those environments, I just keep trying to bring the same spirit of collaboration that they're in many ways not used to. So my projects in Europe in particular, they just don't quite understand. They expect the director to come in and be a kind of miniature tyrant. You know, it's like the world of the theater, and you know, it can be a kind of repository for totalitarian thinking. You know, it's like where all of that went was in the theater, where it's still allowed to be really awful to every single person you work with, and to shout and stomp your foot and say, it's my way or the highway. And, you know, that is just not a vision of the world that I want to put forward, and, you know, like not something I can participate in. So I've always felt a bit of an uneasy, whenever I've gone to Europe to work, I've always felt this kind of uneasiness for that reason.
And this pressure of like, well, what is your concept?
Oh yes, that's the thing, yeah.
And sort of you're supposed to have this kind of one sentence or paragraph long kind of, here's the concept, here's my vision of the piece, whereas it feels like you're trying to enter into a process where there is sort of no absolute answer at the end. You want to present something more multi-voiced, more ambiguous, as opposed to, it often feels like, these sort of certain kinds of productions where they end up being titled like, you know, Seinfeld episodes, where, you know, it's the one with the rotting rabbits at the end of Parsifal. It's the one with the these kinds of one sentence summaries. So this kind of not having that kind of cut and dried sort of textual summary of what's going on.
I really do aspire to that, and I talk about this in the book some, that one of the things I think is so powerful about opera is its capacity to make ambiguity a pleasure. Like that we can go to the opera and if I go back to the story of me being 13 years old and going to see an opera and feeling so disoriented and really off-put from it, it's because the weirdness of it was made to seem normal. You know, everyone around me thought it was totally normal. And I thought it was weird. And opera is weird. And I think that if we can invite audiences into thinking, if you bring so many people together to create one piece, it's going to be kind of messy. And it might not have very clear delineations, even as to what it means. But something I talk about in the book that I've started to become really, ever since doing some research on this, I've really started to realize it's opera's true power right now. It's to sit in a space where you can't quite understand what's happening, and learning to find that enjoyable instead of frightening, instead of a test of your patience. And the research that I did on this was really about, maybe some of you know this, a concept that's called ambiguity tolerance. And this was a field of some research with psychologists in the 1940s, looking at how tolerant people become, like if people are tolerant of ambiguous situations, they tend to see environments that are more democratic, more inviting, more forgiving. The places that have less tolerance for ambiguity are the ones that tended into a more kind of fascist direction, And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. That when we don't have any understanding for things that and we don't even try to understand something that to us on its surface seems against what we believe in, we are really closing ourselves off to so many different ideas in this world. And I bring all this up to say that art in general, I think, really is a fantastic engine for building a love of ambiguity. But I have to say that opera may be the best of all, because it's an inherently ambiguous environment that you're sitting in. So giving people permission to enjoy that ambiguity, to feel that ambiguity is something that enriches our understanding of the world, that to me is something that I feel like goes against the notion of here's the concept. Here's the one idea that I want to draw out of this opera. Some of you I know some of you have seen the project that we just did with the industry at MoCA, the Comet Popea. And this was a merging of two totally different operas. One of the very first operas, the Coronation of Popea, and a brand new opera by George Lewis based on the Du Bois short story, The Comet. And we put these two pieces together in a juxtaposition that while we were doing it, we were trying to understand why we were doing it and what was the purpose of these two pieces living together. And it didn't start from a position of saying, these two pieces are going to illuminate each other in the following ways, A, B, C, D, and then in which case, none of you had to come to see the opera, because I could just give you that list of what we already know. But it was an exploration. It was following a kind of intuitive idea. All of us were following these intuitive ideas. And whatever, any of you that did see it, whatever you drew from it is just as valid as whatever quote-unquote intention that I or George or Monteverdi might have had, And that's the ambiguity that I'm really so interested in, is turning that authorial interpretive power over to you as an audience member.
Yeah, I mean, opera is fundamentally a surfeit, an overload of signals, auditory, visual, the language of gesture, the visual, the textual. There's too much to take in. At its best, you should be just sort of overwhelmed, and so to try to boil it all down to a particular message or to a particular procedure, sort of way of doing things, a particular sort of cut and dried tradition is really sort of a betrayal of what's wonderful about the form.
It is, and yet, I don't want to excise the past either. I also think that we need the past, and I do talk about, of course, the past quite a bit in this book too, is just thinking, what do we get when we do these old operas again? Like, there is so much to get from them if we don't just follow rote, repeat things in a rote way. But if we explore it, it doesn't always also have to be done in reverse order either, but just what if you brought that kind of mindset to each and every time you did an opera? One of the things that I mention in the book is that so many of the things that we imagine living in music is, for me, a kind of it's kind of a faulty construction when we think like the emotions, for example, are in the music. I actually don't think that's possible, because for me the music is is a blueprint. It's like little notes on a page, right? Until it is interpreted and brought to life, that's when we feel the emotion, right? I mean, you can't get an emotion by me just showing you the score. I could show it to you and you could say, well, that looks well arranged. I don't know, maybe who knows what you might say or say. I can't read that, which is perfectly fair. But it takes the humans, all of the humans that all coordinate what it is that they are trying to do at the same time, and let that, then a music sort of flows, and then emotion only lives there. Maybe some of you have experienced this with recordings. We were talking about recordings backstage, and it just reminded me that there are these recordings that we all love because they do draw us into the emotional life of a character or an aria, and then you'll listen to another recording and you'll say, oh, that one didn't do it for me. Like, that one didn't thrill me at all, this actually made me feel kind of cold. I love the one that Leontine Price sings. That's my recording of Aida, for example. And I think that's just a way to say that, and a way to prove that, like, the emotion actually isn't in the Verdi score. The emotion is in how it all unfolds. And that's something I try to bring up in the book over and over again, is that ideas, emotions, a metaphysical, spiritual connection you might feel when you hear this music performed, that is just as much the interpreter as it is the genius composer. It's like it was the whole constellation of people working together so that those ideas can flow, and that's going to be different every single time. And that is why I think of opera as an art form of real rebirth, that it is constantly being recreated as opposed to being regurgitated, like instead it's always being found anew. And then I think then there's no end to what emotional or philosophical or spiritual connections we can draw from it.
Yeah. I did want to ask specifically about Wagner in this connection. And Wagner's obviously, as you've already mentioned, played a particular strong role in your development from the outset, and you actually start off the first chapter of the book talking about Parsifal, which is sort of a surprising point of departure. Certainly not an opera that you'd recommend as anyone's first opera, but to begin this sort of larger philosophical question about opera, certainly anything by Wagner is an excellent place to begin. But so Wagner might seem as though he's sort of the exact opposite of everything you've been talking about in terms of an art form of ambiguity, of collaboration, of many voices, because Wagner, the image of Wagner is of this sort of absolutely domineering presence who writes the music, writes the libretto, directs the opera, creates this festival, this opera house exclusively devoted to his own work. So it's kind of, in one sense, he's sort of the monster of the sort of dominant authorial model. And I think that's true to some extent. But at the same time, there's another side to Wagner, which is about very much a liberation or an explosion, really, of competing perspectives. If you just think about the ways in which this composer has been interpreted politically, from the far left to the far right, every kind of literary, artistic movement, from the late 19th century forward, sort of finding some aspect of Wagner being of use to them, and then looking at opera production, Wagner production after World War II, partly out of this need to separate Wagner from the Nazi legacy being radically reinvented on stage. So you end up with a situation where you begin to lose track of who Wagner originally was. This domineering presence vanishes into this chaos, of this sort of anarchy of competing perspectives. And so actually, I think in the end, Wagner serves as an kind of perversely as an excellent example of the very kind of, and he always was talking about rebirth. getting away from the ossification of tradition. He wanted Bayreuth to be this revolutionary place where a new audience would emerge, and of course it didn't quite turn out that way, but that was his idea, that was the spirit.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have always found myself drawn to Wagner, like so many good Jewish people. We just love Wagner. I don't know why. Yeah, including my
not
good
everyone,
friends.
but
On another, no, but I mean, it's one of those things that I mean, if you are not an opera person, actually Wagner might be a great place to start, because so much of Hollywood would not be thinkable without the music that Wagner wrote. I mean, if you love Star Wars, you've already heard a Wagner opera, basically. Like the next version of it. I actually found myself, it was much easier for me to connect with Wagner when I was younger than Verdi or Donizetti, or like the bel canto is a world I don't really, I'm sorry for those of you that love that part of the operatic world, but I really don't talk about it at all in my books. So if there's probably some other books that you could talk if you want to learn about that. But I do talk about Wagner quite a bit, because I feel that, of course I've learned that this is not true, but I've always thought of Wagner as the person who really wanted to bring theatrical, another level of theatrical life to opera that was so different from everything else that opera was about. It turns out that there were plenty of people before him that was the very thing that they were also after. Like Gluck was all about this. There was so many composers prior to Wagner that all said, the opera has so much potential, and it is stifled by the way it's produced.
Yeah. Every 50 years,
yes.
essentially in operatic history, it's been ossified, and someone comes along saying we have to start over.
Right.
Which is a recurring kind of pattern.
It's really this like cycle. I mean, it's something that I put in the book, a graphic timeline of opera that I didn't want to make a line. I made it a time curve, because I think one of the great things about opera is your experience of time is really layered. That's why it's so great to do these older operas, because you're suddenly in at multiple times at once, and that's a great and very ambiguous space to live in. So I really love that about opera. But Wagner is just the next version of somebody who said, we've got to do it all differently. And then, of course, that becomes ossified, right? And then somebody says, Wagner, no, we can't do anything like Wagner anymore. We have to do something so new, which turns out to be maybe a little bit more like Monteverdi, actually. Like I think about Robert Ashley, the composer who all of his operas are almost all spoken. But in many ways, that impulse for the language of the opera to really come through, that is absolutely Monteverdi. That's absolutely Gluck. There's so many recurrences like this, and I find that really fascinating, and something I wanted to really trace in this book. So it's also a way to say that I don't think Wagner is outdated at all. Like I actually think that there are ways to get away from the authoritarian voice. By not treating him like an authoritarian voice, and by instead the same kind of processes that I undergo when I do a brand new opera, I'm going to bring that into my thinking with Wagner to see what more can this material hold. And of course, for those of you that do already like Wagner, you know that material is so dense and so rich and can mean so many incredible things. So I feel like we're just getting started understanding what Wagner wrote. And I feel that way about all the great operas. And the operas that are being written today, you think to yourself, if people did them set on Mars and redone in a different way, well, would you get something new out of them? And that's something that I find in contemporary opera a real challenge. That actually, I think, as people are trying to understand where opera is today, they tend to go for everything being bound together, that narrative, visual, music, text, everything feels like one inextricable thing. And something I talk about in the book that I try to give in terms of language to an audience is how can you separate those various strands so you can start to understand how multiplicitous opera actually is. And I think that's also a place of great potential.
I want to move to questions in a moment, but just I want to ask specifically about Los Angeles and what drew you here to begin with, and why you feel that the industry was able to come into being here and thrive in a way that it might not have elsewhere.
I don't think it could have. I don't think the industry could have happened anywhere else but here. And I think that a big part of that is people like you that are here that have been part of what the industry's been about. And that's what drew me to start the industry. It's actually Wagner. It goes back to Wagner. When I was the assistant director at LA Opera on their Ring Cycle was when I first started coming to LA. And I just found such an open-minded, passionate, excited, curious audience here. I remember, I know some people didn't like the Ring Cycle. It's okay if you didn't like it. I happen to have found it a totally transformative experience working with Achim Fryer on that production. And it was such a great show in so many ways. But I'll never forget, I think the moment that I realized I wanted to move to LA to start a company where new opera could happen was really in one of the performances of Valkyrie, where it was Act 3 of Valkyrie. I can't remember which one it was, and maybe some of you were there, but it was the end of, the last act of Valkyrie, it was like the entire Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was like totally hushed. You could not hear a pin drop, and the final image kind of ended, the lights went out, and the whole audience just at the same time just like sighed, like in that way that's just like, wow. And I was just thinking the same production probably anywhere else in America would have resulted in booing, would have resulted in people throwing things, because opera in a lot of other places in America is still a very, very closed-minded pursuit. And I just thought, wow, the audience here, because of, I think, audiences' interest in visual arts, for example, cinema, just the way of life in LA that does invite you to be more curious, made it to me seemed like the perfect place to be doing new opera. And so that was when I realized, you know what, this might be a really great place to start an opera company for experimental opera. What sounds perfect, right? And I know I have some friends that I see here that really at first thought, oh, experimental opera in LA, okay, well, good luck, and who I think saw that actually, like, wait a minute, like there is something to this idea that can really work. And so it's been it's been one of the real blessings of my life to be working here and making work here. And it's been in a way also a real laboratory for the way I've been thinking about opera, that I've now finally with this book feel like I've been able to kind of crystallize and put in writing. You might have been able to tell already from the way I'm been talking during this interview. I don't necessarily start from a place of knowing all the answers. I start from a place of like, I'd like to explore this. And it doesn't come from an intellectual place. It comes from a different place. But then over the process of working on it, when the piece is over, then I know what I've done. But I don't really know what I'm doing while I'm doing it, And that might sound careless, but actually I think it's the only way to really create vibrant art, is to say we're going to be open and explore. With opera, we're all going to come together to explore this thing together. And I can't give you the exact words to say what it is that this means. I'm just saying here's the framework. And I know also from many people that are here that I've told them we're gonna do an opera in 24 cars, and they're gonna drive around LA. And I think people looked at me and would say, I do not understand what you're talking about. But then they'd come to see the show and they'd say, oh, it's exactly what you described. And I always found that very rewarding, that the audience for the industry has really grown this appetite of realizing that, like, I don't understand it when I read about it, but I just go and then kind of look back at the wording and realize, oh yeah, it's exactly what was described. So it's been the perfect home for this for the kind of work that we've been exploring today.
Yeah, I made an attempt in 4,000 or 5,000 words, The New Yorker, to describe what was going on in Hopscotch, but ultimately you had to be there. Yes, and you can't get across what it was like. So let's have some questions now. I assume there must be many.
I see one over there. I see Thomas.
Will you talk about what prompted you to do Julius Caesar and the Mount Wilson performances?
Oh, well, Young Caesar, you mean, at the LA Phil? Well, okay, so those were two different initiatives. The Young Caesar was Lou Harrison's opera, which hadn't ever really had a chance to find its footing in kind of the cultural circles that I'd like to see it done at. When the LA Phil invited me to be the artist collaborator for 3 years, I really thought that this is a great chance to put some energy behind some of these works. And I think Lou Harrison, he loved opera. It was one of the only operas he composed, but I keep thinking that's another way to Alex's question earlier about how to expand our idea of what opera is. Some of it implies just going back and seeing which operas haven't been done that are worth doing, and doing them really well, doing them with full imagination and full heart. And so I really thought Young Caesar would benefit from that kind of approach. And so I wanted to do that also because he spent a lot of time in California. He has his house in Joshua Tree, which is now a residency, like an artist residency. And he just feels like he's in the ether. He feels like he's in the ecosystem here. So I wanted to give him a chance to be heard again for audiences. And then the Mount Wilson piece was directed and created by the co-artistic director for the industry, Malik Gaines. And so I was kind of more of a cheerleader for that project than in any other role, and supporting Malik and everyone involved in that project. But that felt like a perfectly industry-like project, taking opera outside of the opera house, going into an environment that is mostly uncomfortable to be sitting in. Also seems to be a recurring theme.
Cold.
Well, cold, exactly. It takes you have to climb a lot of stuff, go drive through a crazy hills. And if you saw the first show, it was raining. So, it felt like a perfect extension of all the ideas of the industry, and reminds me that even as a company for the industry, there's so much support of other artists that I think we can continue to do. So I was so happy that we could bring Malik's project to life in that way. I think Thomas had it.
So what did you do in Bayreuth, and how did it work with the company there? How was it received? And then I'd love to hear Alex comment on how that fit into the history of Bayreuth. And then one more part, what are you going to do when you go back again?
When I go back again there? Well, so I did, in 2018, I did Lohengrin, which it's a very powerful opera because as Alex's book lays out so beautifully, it was a kind of lightning rod opera for so many different political personalities and artists. I mean, it's crazy to think that, an opera like Lohengrin could be something that inspired both Du Bois and Hitler. Somehow both of these personalities, and many, many more.
Baudelaire,
there's just it goes on and on, like what this opera has meant and how it's been, I think, misinterpreted over many, many years. And its connection to Hitler, going to Bayreuth and thinking about the connection between this piece and Hitler was very much on my mind. I was luckily not the first Jewish director there. I was the second Jewish director. The first one had worked the year before me, so
you were the first American director.
I was the first American, yes. Yeah. So
Which is something.
Exactly. So I still was the first something, but actually I was so happy to be only the second Jewish director because it meant that I could try and find what is there to explore in Wagner that does not have to be seen only through an anti-Semitic lens. I think it's an important theme when we talk about Wagner, but I'm of the opinion that it's distracting in performance. I think that's so much more interesting as scholarship and as I think it's crucial in terms of scholarship and crucial in terms of supplementary material around the piece. But I think the operas themselves are where you want to stage a different worldview, And so for me, Lohengrin, I really thought of Lohengrin as potentially a real kind of proto-feminist piece. And that's the kind of piece, that's how I wanted to stage it, to allow it to actually align more with where Wagner was in 1848, 49, when the piece was first written, which is he was a radical leftist. I mean, he was on the barricades as an anarchist. He was best friends with Bakunin and all of these people that were real, like really, really left wing. And again, that's not what we think about when we think about Wagner, especially in Bayreuth, where we think of it as the place where it was holding all of these right-wing Nazi ideologies. So for me, I really wanted to come in and, I won't go into too many. I appreciate your question, but we'll have to do it privately or personally about the experience working there, because it was weird. But that was my mission being there. Really was like, I feel like I want to shift in whatever way possible. I just want to shift the temperature of what it means to be doing a piece, to be doing this work that does have within it something utopian. So how to draw that out and restage that, as opposed to getting too caught up in the history of it. So, I mean, it is an amazing place to go, but you do feel when you're there these kind of, and Alex has been there so many times that you can probably speak just as well to this, is this feeling of this, the poles between this incredibly beautiful vision that Wagner had of this, utopian democratic experience of a work of art that also was supposed to be destroyed. Like the theater was meant to be destroyed at the end of the Ring cycle, and as part of what the whole Ring cycle was about, which was the tearing down of all existing world orders so something new can emerge. And, conservatism starts to creep in, especially once you build a theater, you say, well, I loved that idea, but we're not possibly going to burn this theater down, right? We still have to pay for the theater, so let's keep it going. And there's that element, though, the positive element, and then there's all of this really toxic stuff that's there too. And those worlds really coexist in a way that's really fascinating. And it was a very memorable experience doing it. But I came in and wanted to be so hyper focused on just what it means to think about that that larger vision for what this piece could provide to an audience. I think there's oh, sorry. Let's go here next after that. But go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks so much to you guys both for being here with us today. I just want to ask, so Yuval, your career is really interesting, at least because, or to me, the industry seems like one of the most well-funded small opera companies in America. And so there's this big difference, like when you look at the entire milieu of companies across the country, the kinds of work that they are doing is largely in accordance with the scale of their budgets, unfortunately. So the industry is very unique, I feel like, in this capacity of doing these kind of radically huge projects that are themselves quite small. And so I'm really curious, like, what are the best things, or also what you're talking about, reinterpreting canonical works, like, I bet you there are 15, 20 companies in America that are doing La Boheme with a string quartet, and no chorus. So there's a total radical reinterpretation of these works just kind of because they have to. So I'm really curious, like, what has small indie opera meant for you, and how do you take those ideas that you work with, in the industry and elsewhere into the large institutional setting?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I talk about in the second half of the book too. Just thinking about, are there ways to think about an institution that what is supporting the art making, and how can that be as flexible as it possibly can, so that artists can truly do the creative process, which, as we all know, and as I've said earlier, is really messy. And anytime I've gone into kind of larger operatic spaces, including when I took over the Detroit Opera, they get very good at being a little or a large machine, in which, well, this is how much time we'll give to this and that, and it's all quite formulaic. And I think with my experience at the industry, and I suspect for other small companies, first of all, the sense of every resource matters is a really good attitude to have, I think, with the making of an opera. I think we are no longer really in that era of just like overwhelming like watch the world burn spectacle. Like this is just not responsible anymore. And you know, the industry in a way has never really had that kind of problem, because every resource is the result of a lot of chasing. You know, every single thing that we've done has had to get acquired and found. And so I have learned to appreciate every single dollar, every single wooden plank that we've been able to get, you know, donated to us very often from Anna Walt Lumber. But, you know, everything, you know, nothing is just there for us to take, you know. Everything is a relationship, and everything is a negotiation, and everything is because somebody else wants it to happen. You know, like hopscotch, I have a chapter on hopscotch, the making of it. You know, that was truly gargantuan, but then I look at what we spent on it, and we spent less than what we do when we revive you know, an old Traviata production in Detroit. I mean, the same cost, so to speak. So it's like there's scale of imagination, and then there's the ability to take resources and think differently about how the resources come to be, and then inviting the people that are not part of the art but are part of the producing, and to say, you know, this is what you're part of. You're helping us make this happen, you know, and we can maybe do all of this kind of construction if we have your support, you know. We can maybe, you know, I remember going in to talk to the person that runs all the limos and trying to figure out how to talk him into doing this piece. I mean, I don't know why he said yes, but he did. So it's that sense of also, and I think what's been exciting for me and for the industry, and that I do wish other opera companies can find their way to do it, which is just that connection with the community around you, not just the donors, but also, like I said, the businesses that said, we want to help make this with you. It's like, that's where we got so much buy-in into making these operas happen. And I think that we can, you know, like these larger opera companies, they might think, well, we have our set budgets, and when we're out of that budget, you can't do what you can't do, instead of thinking creatively. And so I try to bring that attitude with me in these larger spaces. And again, like with this book, I'm hoping I'm giving some of these companies and producers maybe some language to think differently about some of this stuff. We had a question here. I think the microphone's on.
Last question for today.
Thank you. Just as an aside, your comments about the openness of Los Angeles, I think nobody told you the mantra, whatever.
Whatever. Yeah, that feels right.
You want to put on an opera in the cars? Whatever.
Right. Well, I actually saw that experience firsthand, and Alex, you wrote about it, which is, you know, there was a scene, Mads, who works here, was actually in this scene that was in Chinatown, and it took place in Chinatown Plaza. And a burger restaurant had just opened there, and there were all of these people that were just eating their burgers and fries and sitting there, and just this opera was happening in front of them over and over and over again all day. And they were like, you just saw them kind of being like, okay, whatever. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think there's a certain amount of that really works. So.
But I do have a question, because I think what we're seeing in the attempt to bring opera into the 22nd century is two different paths, and I wonder how you feel about that. You've done both, because what we're seeing is new operas, and when the Met opens its season with Grounded, you know that there's been a big change, and last season I think they had 3 new operas of living composers. So there's that, and obviously you've done a good deal of that. But then there's tinkering, shall we say, with the classics. Yeah. And I can remember many years ago now, turning on the television one night, and my husband and I were looking at it. We seemed to be watching a gangster movie. And then I heard Mozart. And I said, what is this? What is going on? And you know what I'm talking about, of course. Who was one of your great predecessors, a modern director of opera, who decided to put on was it not the Marriage of Figaro? One of the great Mozart operas, only set
Don
in
Giovanni, right?
Don Giovanni, of course, set in the 40s in New York, I think.
Was it I think it was 80s? I don't know. I thought it was really contemporaneous. But anyway, yes. So, yes.
So those seem to me two very different strains. And the tinkering, on the one hand, can lead to a lot of different conversations. I mean, we don't tinker with Rembrandt. There it is.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Stella changed the visual field, and you have modern art.
Yeah. Well, this is actually a comparison that I do bring up in the book, which is it's a very different medium, right? This is a painting is painted and finished. An opera is never finished. There is no such thing as the finished work. There is just the notes that are left behind. So if you are to do them again, then you're doing them with new bodies. There's new voices. There's new people in the orchestra, as Alex said earlier. There's no real reason to believe it was done the same way 150 years. Totally different vocal production 150 years ago. So why is it that we expect to do, for me, I just think, what if Bizet did not want Carmen in red? And he said, I don't want to see my Carmen in red. And the director says, no, she has to be in red. And now whenever we see Carmen, we see her in that red dress, unless it's a different, like that feels so sad for poor Bizet, that he only ever sees his creation only the way that the director decided back in the 19th century. It's like, well, what else was Bizet interested in around Carmen? And how else could Carmen not just look but behave? And what's the relationship between her and John? You could completely draw out entirely new ideas from older materials without changing the words or without changing the music, because it's so. I think any of the really great operas are so open-ended that they actually are not complete until we complete them in the act of a recreation. And I think that's one of the main things that gives me great hope about opera, is it's not a statue, it's not a painting. It is going to be constantly redone every single time. Every generation will have its own version of these operas, and I find that very exciting. And I think the new operas, to what Alex also said earlier, which I totally believe, it's like that is such an important counterbalance to the idea of people living right now with the sounds in our ears that we hear right now. That has to create a new form. There's no way that, we're not writing for the same orchestra anymore. We're not writing for the same voices anymore. And I think the new operas are helping really connect with what is right now. And so that's so crucial. And I've been very encouraged to see so many opera companies realize that when they don't do new operas, there's no real future there, I think. So I think it's I think that's been an encouraging move, And again, like with newer pieces, the same way 100, 200 years ago, new operas were not always good. And that's okay. And it's okay for them to be like, they tried something. Okay, well, that one didn't work. But the next one they did was amazing, Verdi wrote so many operas. For me personally, not all of them are that great. Some of them are spectacular and the best operas of all time. And some of them are like works that he needed to do to get to what he really wanted to do, I don't love all the Wagner operas either, like
you don't love Rienzi?
Rienzi, exactly, right? And there's many composers we've never heard of, but Wagner or Verdi or Puccini might have heard them and said, oh wait, they did something there that's really interesting, and that is then part of the stream that we're all going along with. And so I think that's part of the patience we have to have with new work, is to realize you have to go and you have to be there and you have to support it. And you may not like it, and it may not be performed again in 30 years, and that's totally fine. And then the 1 out of 100 will be the ones that define our own time. And but we'll only get there if we rabidly go and support them, even if it's like, what, that one didn't work, but I'll go to the next new one, no matter what.
Great. Well, I think we have to wrap things up, but. Thank you so much, Yuval, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And Yuval will be signing books in the lobby, I believe, afterward. The conversations can continue, and we've only touched on a few aspects of this very wide-ranging, wonderful book, so the conversations will go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.